Hi everybody, this is Alex Ryback, Director of Product Management at Revenera, and I wanted to welcome you to our 2020 Office Hour Highlights video. So we did 10 sessions last year of various SCA topics for our customers and partners, and wanted to create a highlight reel in case somebody missed the sessions and does not have time to go back and rewatch them all. So this is a compilation of all of the greatest hits from 2020 on various topics related to product, customer issues, best practices, and general guidance to our customer base. So thanks again for watching, and as always, we welcome any feedback, including future session topics. Thanks so much. Take care. Today's agenda is DevOps. Wanted to kind of set it up real quick, talk about why you would want to do DevOps, what are some of the benefits of doing it. This is not intended to be a sales pitch, so I'm going to keep this brief. But really I want to get into the main slide, which is how do you get our deep scan and automated package level scanning to work together, and what's a process to do that. So the reason that it is important to do automation and to integrate with your development toolchain is that open source content comes into your organization in many forms. There's 8 kind of examples on the bottom here. So people typically understand that if they work with partners or work with other vendors, they're going to get a distribution from them at some point, and they don't have necessarily tight controls over what that organization does. So that's kind of the common cases. Somebody wrote some code for you, you take it in, you incur the risk. So it would be good to have a good understanding of what they're bringing in. Likewise, if you use an open source project, you are taking whatever those projects currently have in the snapshot, right? You don't have a lot of visibility or controls over who's contributed to the project, which organizations are behind it. So again, kind of similar ideas, you're taking some code into your product. However, there are many forms in which open source can come in. So we're all aware of the software packages containers. There's build dependencies. There's source code from copy paste, right? You can go into MSDN articles or helper websites and get some sample code that perhaps gets copied and pasted into your own proprietary code. Come in the form of binaries. It could be multimedia files. It could be commercial code. So there's a lot of different ways that things can enter, and whenever you are setting up your own internal governance programs, it's important to consider all these. Now, certainly they don't all have to be considered with the same urgency. Some may or may not apply to your organization, but it's important to make sure you think through these and understand which of these you want to manage and control, and which may not be as great of an importance. So then if we look at, well, why do you integrate? What are some of the benefits? There's really 3 that we always talk about. So one is data currency. And what we mean by that is if you have a process that's mainly designed to be manual and you do ad hoc scanning or audits at some interval in your development cycle, you are not going to have an up-to-date picture of what is happening in your code base. So audit reports or snapshots, they age out. Compliance issues are typically identified too late. Your code base keeps changing, but your results are static. And if you keep waiting and changes accumulate, you end up with a really high volume of results. So it's going to be hard to burn that down. So we always try to preach continuous use is a good manageable approach. Chip away, don't do this at the very end of a release cycle, and get into the methodology just like you would with automated testing to do this early, often, and frequent, and make sure that there's good visibility and transparency into the results. The second thing is external forces. There are a lot of organizations, and this is just kind of a short list here, that are pushing for standards and regulations and compliance actions. Anything that can harm you, anything that is a medical device, anything that is a vehicle you're driving, or airplane, or anything ultimately that could do harm will eventually have regulations. And the regulations are going to circle around being able to prove that you have a governance program in place, being able to generate output in certain format with certain content. And we anticipate that in the next couple of years, there will be a big push in the supply chain use case where people will not do business with you unless you can disclose to them what are the ingredients in your products. So that is going to be a forcing function that will require people to have some sort of process in place, whether it's tracking things in the spreadsheet, having multiple solutions in place, but there will have to be some sort of process that is managed and documented within an organization. And then the third one is it just makes life easier, right? The more you have automated, the more you have a standard process where somebody doesn't have to remember to push a button, the more it becomes manageable to be able to comply with such requirements. Remediation efforts just become a natural byproduct of doing this automatically. So very analogous to automated testing and being able to just have this be a part of the engineering process. So let's talk about, well, I guess let me stop here for a second. Any questions, comments, feedback on the previous two slides? Okay, I will keep going. All right, so let's talk about where and when to scan. And we support lots of different scan events. So we try to kind of categorize this with where do you do it, what do we support, and what is the use case behind it. So the ultimate kind of shift left strategy is scan artifacts before they enter your code stream. Most of our customers today, and I'd be kind of interested in opinions here, try to have some concept of a blessed or golden artifact repository where there is some governance placed upon being able to understand what's coming into your company and being able to vet it, being able to have a concept of allowed usage and whether it's allowed to use downstream and in what context, and then not repeating the process every time this artifact shows up. So scanning your artifact repository, and we do have a fairly basic Artifactory plugin in place to do that, allows you to understand what assets you have in your repository and which ones you may want to be concerned about, may want to quarantine, may want to define policies to capture downstream as they make their way into the code. The second is an IDE integration, right? And scanning as part of the developer ecosystem on their machine before they check in code. And think of this as a smoke test, right? Just like a developer hopefully is unit testing their code before they check it in to a team build. They should be smoke testing their composition of the code that they're changing to make sure that they are not introducing a problem that's going to come back downstream and cause them to have to rework the code. So this is a way to scan on developer's laptop. We've got a couple of plugins to support this, and it will help detect issues early before check-in and make it easier for the developer to fix them. Then if we move downstream, now we're talking about a build. And now you have repository artifacts coming in as part of the build. You've got developer code modifications coming in as part of the build. And this is the part where automation is a great fit, because as part of doing your build, as part of doing your automated tests in the build, you are automatically scanning, and hopefully you have policies defined that will catch any non-compliant items and potentially push them into Jira, or potentially send an email to the person to be able to alert them that a change is required. There we move on to deep dives. So assuming you do some of the green, blue, and red boxes, there will be cases where that is not enough. That is not enough resolution. That's not enough depth. And there are periodic deep scans on the Code Insight server in the traditional manner, where you either upload your code or use a SCM plugin to sync code. But this is a process that requires manual analysis, and we'll go deeper beyond packages and automated discovery to make sure that you are building your bill of material to the level of detail that your process requires. This is typically going to be done less frequently than automated scanning, and it will be done in an incremental manner where you are looking at things that are changing over time and not necessarily reanalyzing files that have not had changes in them. And then finally, containers. Right, so there are cases where all you have is a container. Right? You may have a vendor who has developed a piece of an application for you, or an application itself, and you are deploying it, and all you can scan is a container. Or there may be cases where you have access to source, where you're definitely going to get more information out of the scan. But containers are kind of your last line of defense as you are deploying your applications in a container environment. There is definitely an opportunity there to do scans to understand what are the environmental dependencies and what are you actually deploying on the machines. So if you look at kind of top to bottom, we're really going from left to right as far as tracking the code and how continuous deployment occurs. Okay, so I'm going to stop here and see if there's any questions, comments, or feedback.
I have a question. I'm not sure if this is the place to ask with respect to IDE.
Sure.
While we like to have few, Flexera to the IDE environment, does it increase the number of licensing and the cost, based on the usage at the IDE level?
I don't believe so. I mean, I'm happy to defer to someone in sales if they want to take it, but we price based on developers who contribute to code base, and there's ranges of that. So by the time we've issued pricing, we've already accounted for the fact that you've got an engineering team with a set of developers that are contributing. So the plugins are not an additional cost at this time.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, anybody in sales have a different response? Okay. Any other questions, comments? All right. So let's move to the how do we do this? And this is the last slide I have, and then we get into open Q&A. So this is going to get really busy because there's just, unfortunately, a lot of things to account for. But this is the simplest way I could think of trying to represent how do you actually use our product to be able to support the use case. Now, I will kind of inject futures into the narrative here on what we're doing roadmap-wise to be able to address the fact that there's a lot of steps you have to take to achieve this. And we'll talk about when these things will come out and which releases they'll be targeted for this year. But this is designed to show the process where you combine a standard project for a standard scan and an inventory-only project for a remote scan on the build server. Let's see. Again, there's a question on best practice to scan respect security vulnerability, so it'll be part of the narrative here. Okay, so first thing we have, and what's central to the entire process, is if we're doing automated scanning, right, we want to tie it to the build. The reason we want to tie it to the build is because the build is taking in source materials from your organization. Perhaps there is source copy and pasted in from outside. Perhaps there are external repos that are being pulled into the build. And the build ultimately kicks out a set of build artifacts. So the build is central to coordinating what's going in, what's coming out. And also the one benefit of integrating with the build is that you can tie your results to a direct action. So if you're scanning as part of a build, you know the build number, you know that the findings are related to a particular set of check-ins, you know when it occurred, you have the artifacts that came out of the build. So it is very natural to develop a history of results and a history of the work that's tied to build numbers. And it's a place you can go back in time and understand what happened to get you to the point. The other reason that it's nice to tie to the build is if you do it often enough, you get into a good cadence and you get as early as possible indication of anything that may be going wrong. Now, when you look at a build, there's really two things that we see. Yeah, and this is being recorded, so you can, we'll post the link to the recording. So there's two things that we're dealing with. We're dealing with the materials coming into the build from what's developed in your organization and typically stored in either an internal or external repo. We're dealing with a build processing manifest files and pulling in direct and translate dependencies. And we're dealing with the compiled binaries that are generated as part of the build that get you the build artifacts, which puts everything together and assembled into files that you either host or release to your customers. So this is kind of the natural place for us to live, very kind of akin to automated testing, same methodology, same benefits of doing it. So now let's go through what do you do. So we have two different project types, and this is all kind of within the context of version 7. So we have two project types today. We have an inventory-only project, which is designed to be populated by a remote scan plugin. It is designed to be aligned with an early and often alerting use case, which means that we're going to scan frequently, we're going to scan early in the process, we're going to continuously rescan, and we want to be able to act on the findings based on our policy in an automated manner. The other side of the coin is the green box that'll show up eventually when we reveal more of the slide, which is our standard project. And the standard project is kind of legacy Palamita Flexera functionality, right? It is designed to be, our scanner assumes the code is local on our server. We look at every single file. We do forensic analysis for exact and source matches. And typically there is going to be a human analyst as part of the process to look at file level results and further refine the bill of materials. It is very much designed to be a less frequent operation, but hopefully an ongoing one at a steady cadence, so it's not just done ad hoc. Right? And we'll get to all those points. So the first thing you do is you create an inventory-only project to scan the post-build artifacts. You configure the remote scan plugin for your build CI/CD server, and you point it to the inventory-only project. So the way this works in our product is you create a project, you then go deploy a plugin, and the plugin will maybe go into Jenkins or whatever build system you may have. You will then decide where you want to invoke the scan. I typically recommend starting with nightly builds. You do not want to start with continuous builds because the frequency will be too great in the beginning, but certainly the goal should be to progress from nightly to continuous as your process matures. So as you understand how to handle the results, how the automation will work in your deployment around getting back to engineering with any issues, what are your SLAs for people responding to issues, what happens when you rescan and issues start piling up. All right, so until you understand the nature of how this works and how it impacts your process and make the refinements to make sure that the process works for you, I would recommend sticking most frequently at a nightly basis and then making it more rapid as you move forward. So let's talk about settings. So there are two key things to do here in this use case. And again, remember, the use case is not as a source of truth or where you're going to generate notices and compliance reports. This use case is all about containment. It's about identifying problems early and often. It's about sending alerts if things change. And it's about keeping your bill of materials reflective of the files that are produced by the build. So you want your policy profile to really focus on automated rejection only. Right? This is not where you're going to do your reviews. This is designed to be an automated test for compliance or vulnerability failures. And you may choose on how severe you want to treat the issues. Do you want to fail the build? Do you want to create JIRAs that go back to the developer backlog? Do you maybe only want to rely on email notifications and not slow people down, right? So it's really up to you on how you want to configure the consequence of a failure. The second thing you want to do is we have an opportunity in our system to configure projects to automatically create remediation tasks. So what that means is if you do a scan based on a nightly build and we find an item that is non-compliant either because of a license or maybe a vulnerability, severity, or a minimum score, that item can be automatically rejected based on the policy. And as a consequence of the rejection, we can also create a remediation task assigned to the development contact configured for the project and optionally create a corresponding JIRA that goes back into the developer backlog. All right, so now you've created a loop where you do a build, we have an inventory item, the inventory item doesn't pass the compliance check, and a JIRA shows up back in the developer backlog. So again, all of this is optional, but this is the standard recommendation on how to configure it. Once you do that, you do have an opportunity to perform manual triage, although this is typically not the place to do it because these are going to be quick turn builds and you don't want to slow down the process. But we do have functionality to be able to go in, manually create additional inventory in the inventory only projects, as well as recalling or deleting false positive inventory that's been created. I would typically not advise that you spend too much time on this step. Once we complete the work to merge the two projects, it'll be a much better time to do that work, and we'll talk about it on the green side. And then the final step is you periodically want to export this data into a JSON data file. So we've got both Web UI and REST API support for this. And the reason you want to do that is this will be your feedback into your standard project, which will be your source of truth, to be informed by nightly scan results to keep your BOM up to date. Okay, so let me stop here for a second, see if there's any questions on anything on the right side. Is anybody doing this part or trying to do this part? And if so, anybody care to share their experience? You know, what works, what doesn't work, what's difficult or frustrating?
So far, I'm Palani. Yeah, so far we have done only code base. We are trying to do integrate into the CI/CD pipeline with the Jenkins plugin.
Mm-hmm.
With that, with the workflow, once it has been set up, we want to, again, the last step, what you said, where we want to export the inventory found on the build artifact into the code base, corresponding standard project.
Mm-hmm.
So that's a plan. We are migrating from V6 to V7, so it's in the pipeline to do that. And is there any, in terms of accuracy, I would say with the build artifact, the second step is going to find more than the code base, especially with respect to the transitive dependencies.
Mm-hmm. So, yeah, I guess let me talk about dependencies a little bit. So in and build artifact inventory only project scan, dependencies don't really need to be done because your build will reconcile them, right? So there's no need to look at the manifest file and determine what's a potential dependency, because as a consequence of doing the build, you have actually reconciled to the proper build targets and you have all the files in your build output directory. So we typically say don't turn that feature on in the blue case. In the green case, we'll talk about it, but depending on how much of both sides you do, you may or may not want to use dependencies there as well. So we'll get to that in 1 minute.
Thank you.
Sure. Okay, so let's talk about the green side. So now the green side is a standard project. Again, this is kind of our legacy scan model where we bring the code to us as opposed to going to where the code is. It is designed to be your ongoing source of truth for a particular project. It is designed to scan your pre-build code base, so the contents that go into producing the build. There's an asterisk there because there's an option. So one way to do this is to do the blue via the inventory only project. The other way to do this is to only scan the code base going in, to turn on dependencies, to deal with dependencies via manifest files, and to integrate into your build using our REST API. Right, so then what you're basically saying is you are scanning your source materials, you are syncing your source materials to the same label or target that the build synced to produce the build, and you're only relying on our standard deep scan to be able to manage the results of the build. This gives you an opportunity to more frequently scan your code base, but it also puts more burden on analysts because each scan will produce scan results, and at some point somebody needs to burn those down. Our recommendation today is to leverage both the blue and green. We are working on merging project types. That is a piece of work that's underway. It was initially targeted for the R2 release. We've had to push it out to R3, which is planned for August. But the way that this will look when we're all said and done is you will have a single project. There will not be a distinction anymore. And the project will be able to support both standard scanning on the scan server, as well as an unlimited set of remote plugins that will all feed inventory into the same bill of materials. So you will have a unified view across your remote scans as well as your local scan server scans. So I'll talk about that more at the end. Okay. So once you have created a project, you now need to configure the scan profile. Scan profile controls the various types of scanning that we do, controls the level of dependency scanning that we support, and controls a level of automation and kind of order precedence in the various techniques that we deploy. So if you are using a standard project alone, not doing the blue, you want to turn on dependencies because you want to make sure you're not skipping all the third-party material that gets pulled in during the build. If you are using both green and blue, and you're doing frequent build integrated scans and less frequent deep scans, you do not need to turn on dependencies because those dependencies would have been reconciled in your scan of the build artifacts. And when you import those results into your project, you will get that inventory created for you. If you do turn on dependency scanning, there is a higher likelihood that you will end up with redundant inventory based on the manifest files in the code base, as well as the binaries or the packages that are pulled in during the build. Okay. Next step is policy profiles. So in the blue box, policies are designed to be automated rejection only, where you want to catch non-compliant items. In the green world, your policies are all about automated reviews. So you may have auto reject policies to still identify items that are non-compliant, but you also want to focus on auto approval policies for things that are permissively licensed, don't have vulnerabilities above a certain score, and whatever other criteria you have in your corporate policy. Now, a couple of things that we're doing this year in the R3 releases, we are going to expand criteria for policies. We will support policies based on usage fields. So you will be able to say LGPL is auto approved for non-modified code, but perhaps rejected for modified code if you're distributing the product. So you'll be able to get to similar what you can do in version 6 of our policies. And we're also planning on expanding policies as a way to configure your inventory priority. So today, this is a hard-coded static algorithm, but we want to make it configurable where a license of type weak copy left may be a P1 inventory item, or it may be P2, depending on if it's a hosted or a distributed application. So those are the two areas and policies we're going to improve, and that'll give you more controls over automating the review process. The next thing you want to do is get the code to the machine. So you either want to manually upload a project code base, or you want to configure source SCM plugins to be able to get a snapshot of the code that corresponds either to a date timestamp or to a particular snapshot that the last build consumed. We do have kind of one thing I want to bring up here is we do have some technologies around automatically scanning Git repositories. So when you have an option, it's always better to configure the SCM client to be able to do a Git clone to the machine, as opposed to just downloading a zip file from Git. There are some infrastructure Git files that we look at to do automated discovery, and those simply aren't part of a zip file distribution from GitHub. So where possible, do a clone as opposed to doing just an upload of a zip file. Next step is you have to determine the frequency of how often you want to do this. We see customers doing this weekly, bi-weekly, monthly, quarterly. It just depends mainly on the resources you have available, whether you work with our services team to do audits, whether you have your own folks, how much bandwidth you have to process results. There typically is little value in doing scans on the standard project if there's nobody to look at the results, right? You're going to get the same output in the inventory only project automation wise as you will in the standard project. So the cadence is really driven by how many resources do we have, how often can they look at this, and how much volume can they get through based on the bandwidth. It is totally fine to start infrequent and make it more frequent as your policy and your process matures. It's better typically than going too frequent and being overwhelmed with the result. Okay, so now we got to a step where we connect the two. So you now have exports coming out of your inventory only projects. And again, this is supported by REST API as well. So this can be scripted to be an automatic byproduct of doing a build. Likewise, on the import side, this can be done manually, or it can be done scripted through a REST API to pull those exports into the standard project. So once you do that, what you end up having is you have a unified view of inventory based on forensic scans and analysis, as well as automated results based on the code base scanned, as well as the build artifacts, including resolved dependencies as part of the build. So now you get into reconciliation, and there's an asterisk here again because this is the complicated step. This is the one thing that we are focusing on fixing in the second half of this year through some inventory hygiene functionality. But the idea here is you have a set of inventory produced by scanning in the green project. You then have a set of inventory that you're going to be importing from the blue project. We do as well as we can today to try to make sure that you have a unified list, but there will certainly be cases where you have different component IDs. Your scan of the code base may found version 1, build artifact may found version 1.1, and it's really at the moment up to the human to say, which one is right. Maybe both based on the source and artifacts. It may be that one scan produced better results than the other, so a manual merge is required. Now we do have some scripts available, so reach out to us if and when you get to this step and you need assistance, but we do have some scripts that do some of this automatically. It'll look for inventory, for example, with the same component in different versions, or inventory based on what you created manually versus what you imported, and we'll automate some of the process for you. But again, this is one area where there is some manual work required, and we are working on making more features in the product to do this on your behalf and to recommend actions to take so you can remember to do it in the future. So those are planned for the last couple of releases this year. Now we get into, one second here, these branches and no branch. Yes, so definitely this is an important piece, and hopefully what we see here is that by looking at manifest files in the code base as well as the artifacts in the build, that those items reconcile into unified inventory because it's based on the same components with the same detection techniques. But certainly there will be deviations that will require work. If you do, again, get to this point and you're having trouble or you're seeing that there is mismatches, let us know, give us sample data so we can make these features better to do a lot of this for you rather than making it a manual process. Okay, so now we get to manual analysis. And there are a couple of things here. Number one, there's obviously, since you're doing the code-based scans, there's going to be file level scan results that can be used to further refine inventory. But there's also an opportunity to create manual inventory for false negatives and to suppress manual inventory or to suppress inventory for false positives. I mentioned that I don't necessarily recommend doing this step over here on the right side because it just happens too frequent and we don't want to override results. On this side, it does make sense to do it because this is your published bill of material reflects your source of truth for that code base as a combination of manual and automated work. So you do want to make sure that this bill of material is accurate as it could be. So once you've done that, the next step is to publish your inventory, to go through your standard reviews. So some of these will be done based on the policy. Some of these will require manual review. And of course, as part of that, you can further refine the policy to automate in the future. And then final step is any sort of artifacts you produce as far as notices, compliance reports, project reports, audit reports, all of that should be done out of the green project because that is your complete bill of material. And then as I kind of started this whole conversation, the final thing that we have some customers looking at doing and certainly recommended is coming up with this notion of a golden project, right? So what this means is everything that has gone through this process, everything that's been vetted, reviewed, has notices created for it, you can extract it out of your standard project and pull it into a single project, whether or not it has files behind it. That is your source of truth for all of the inventory across your organization. The best way I can think of introducing this is with a flow. So let's talk about how right now workflow is designed to work in version 7. So no, we have not built or rebuilt workflow engine in 7. What we have done in 7 is we have built functionality in the 7 UI and REST API to allow us to integrate into an external workflow system. One of the systems that we integrate with is our own version 6 workflow. So that means any of the functionality that people have been using as part of their 6 deployment is still on the table. All the features, functions work, all the form definition, the routing, the policy, conditions of use, all of those features are still in play. The only real use case change is you start in 7, you end in 7, and you use 6 as the backend process to review requests. So let's look at what a flow would be like. So the user experience starts with version 7. And again, this is the way we have it now. Certainly open to feedback once I'm done with this on do people have a desire to maybe start in 6 and populate back into 7, so we can certainly talk about other use cases. But today what we've done is a developer would come into 7, they would create an inventory item, and this can be done manually. It can be done as a consequence of a scan, right? So you can do a scan, you can do a data import from another system, but you end up with an inventory item. And the first thing that happens in 7 when you do that is we create a manual review task by the system it's created, and it is assigned to the appropriate user in the function. So we have an inventory item, we've got an open task to review it, and at that point you have a choice. You can either manually conduct the review in 7 by approving or rejecting it, or you can then delegate to conduct a more thorough review. So the way that that process works is right now we have this implemented as a script using our REST API. And what it does is it is scheduled to run periodically. It could be a cron job or it could be manual invocation. And what the script does is it goes into 7 and it gets a list of all the projects, iterates over them, and finds all inventory items that have manual open manual review tasks. So this would be a set of inventory items that have not been reviewed and have an action item assigned to a reviewer to conduct the review. The second thing it does is it checks a new field that we have in 7, which is an associated external workflow ID. And if there is a value in that field, then we go back to the configured external workflow system and we update information in version 7 about it. If there is no associated workflow ID, then we call external workflow APIs to create essentially a request behind the scenes, passing in information from version 7 inventory items. So component version, license information, we could extend it to also handle the usage fields that we have in 7, vulnerability data if that's relevant. So anything that is relevant in your use case to conduct a review. And the goal of this step is to eliminate redundant input. So anything that we've already captured in 7 as part of the inventory item will get passed into the workflow instance, and then additional questions will then be surfaced based on the form design, and then all of that will get handed over to the reviewers to conduct the review. The next part is whether there was a request or not. We do update the inventory item back in 7. We also put data into the task for the manual review that explains where the request sits, who's current reviewer, what's the review status, so basic information so you can understand where the request is in its life cycle. After that, we then check for has workflow completed. So if the request has not completed the review or an external, whatever the object may be called in another system, if it has not completed review, we essentially exit out, and then the next cycle of the script will further update. If it has completed the review, we pass additional information back in the code insight. We close the manual review task for you. We set the status to either approved or rejected based on the terminal state of the request, and then we exit out. All right, so at the end of this whole loop, what you end up with is an inventory item that is linked to a corresponding request or workflow instance in another system, and some high-level information about who conducted the review, what was the terminal status, any sort of additional information, notes, whatever is relevant to the inventory item, and all of that is visible in the 7 UI. So I'll show you the screenshot in a second. And the final part is while all of this is happening, the users who conduct the reviews will go into their workflow system, whether it's Six, Jira, or another commercial system, and they will do the reviews in that product. Right? So we're delegating all of the review process into the workflow system, and all of the bill of material management and tracking ends up happening in 7. Okay. So when we talk about kind of where we are today. So today we have a script-based integration available for version 6 workflow, which internally implements JBPM as the workflow engine. So that means you can use 7 for all of your scanning, inventory management, policies potentially, third-party notices, reporting, all of that is done in 7. And we can then piggyback off of 6 to facilitate the deep dive review of an inventory item. We also have a script-based prototype that Sean will show for Jira. Very basic, very much a proof of concept. But if you have a fairly straightforward process where you don't have dynamic form needs, for example, right, where questions come up based on previous answers, it is certainly possible to model routing in Jira, since that's typically where a lot of your users are already sitting and doing other work. And we can integrate with Jira through their REST API to be able to facilitate a similar process. We're also looking at a couple other things. We would like to do an implementation on an off-the-shelf open source workflow solution. So we have an example available for a system outside of one we've developed or Jira. And we're looking at potentially picking a couple commercial workflow systems as another set of proof of concepts or integrations into other systems. So I want to open it up for a second to, number one, see if there's any questions or comments about this, but also if people are using a workflow other than ours in their company for other purposes, could you let us know which vendors are providing that so that we can try to kind of stack rank and prioritize appropriately for anybody we have listed here or anybody you may want to add to the list. So I'm going to stop here for a second and just open it up for questions, comments, and feedback on this.
Hey, Alex, this is Dan Stengel.
Hey, Dan.
This may be apocryphal, but have you considered SharePoint workflow integration?
No, but makes sense.
Just because it's often the lowest common denominator in a Microsoft-based organization.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, makes sense. We are looking at Azure DevOps. They have essentially bug tracking and project lifecycle functionality, so that could be another one for Microsoft Stack users. But yeah, SharePoint makes sense. I mean, what we're doing, and this will be a little more clear when we get to the roadmap slides after the demo, is we're using this right now to prototype several integrations, which will then get crystallized into a plugin framework in version 7 with native plugins. And plugins will be responsible for orchestrating the interaction between 7 and a workflow system. Right now we're doing it in scripts just because it's easier and quicker to make changes and deliver them, but this will become a native product in 21. Right, so SharePoint makes sense, any sort of homegrown workflow, perhaps even as simple as Excel, but certainly we're open to any suggestions. Anybody else on the phone using a commercial workflow product for other processes at their company that they're willing to share? All right, so we'll come back to that later. Okay, the final thing I wanted to talk about here is some of the configuration options and the things that would be controlled. So obviously the connection, right? So we need to be able to specify where this workflow instance exists, how to connect to it, the credentials of users to connect to the system. We want to be able to control association of the project in Code Insight to the external workflow project, right? So the way that we envision doing this is there would be a global configuration for a workflow plugin or connector, and then there would be project-specific fields that we would set that are unique to that project. The other thing would be mapping of Code Insight fields to the external workflow fields. So where do you want us to put the component version license information? We do in 7 capture usage fields, so whether something has been modified or how it's being distributed, crypto, linking information. So all of that data could get mapped into the corresponding fields on the form in an external workflow system. Being able to select what data you want to bring back to us. Right? You may want to have the current reviewer, you may want to have any sort of review notes, obviously the terminal status, but basically mapping what comes in, what goes out, and what comes back in. And then the sync frequency, right? How often do you want us to run this process? And perhaps at some point we may have an event that triggers this, or we may just have a background job that runs every few minutes and says, is there something you need to process, and then go ahead and executes it. So let me stop here again, see if there's any questions, and if not, I'll turn over to Sean to do a demo. Oh, I'm sorry, I forgot one last thing, the screenshot. So the way that all this comes back to the product is we have a new field on inventory details, which is the associated workflow instance. The field stores 2 things. It stores a URL to jump into the corresponding request or workflow instance in an external system. And under the info bubble here, it stores a dialog with arbitrary key value pairs. So an example we have here, we are returning the corresponding version 6 request ID URL, the current review level in the routing, as well as the current assignee. But this is unlimited. You can return any number of fields you want. You can return both URLs as well as the static strings. And this is where the mapping between what we send to the workflow system and what comes back would end up being shown in the UI in this place. Okay, so Sean, I think we're ready to kick it over to you. So,
Okay.
Chris, do I need to make him present, or can you just take it?
I think you need to throw me the ball. Okay.
Yep.
I got it.
Yep. I made Alex made Sean presenter.
Okay, great.
Yep. And just a reminder, folks, if I know there's a lot of kind of background noise with everybody being home and all that. If you don't mind just muting while we're doing the presentation, be much appreciated. Of course, unmute when you have a question for Alex or Sean.
Can everyone see my screen over here, the FlexNet Code Insight? Yes?
Yes.
Okay, great. All right, so as Alex mentioned, everything starts with the creation of an inventory item. This could be done post-scan, or it could be done manually disclosing an item. The specific use cases for the scripts that have been created so far are based on a manual disclosure, and that basically, as we cycle through those open tasks, we see if the item has been disclosed or not. So with that in mind, as I add a component, I'll go in here, I'll look up a specific component, so I'll say OpenSSL, and I will select the version that I'm specifically interested at this point in time. And what I'll do is I'll actually mark it as being disclosed. So in the world that we created the script in the first case, it's all about kind of a pre-approval process. So we're saying, hey, this is something we are manually disclosing. And then we're able to actually use that on the back end for some sort of like validation type thing where we can see that, what we disclosed is that actually also found during a scan. So this field can be keyed off on a few different use cases depending on what we're doing. So once I do this, I create the component via a system setting, a default system setting. I have a manual review task automatically created for this item. This one just happens to be associated to a legal entity, but that's just kind of how it is by default. That does not really matter. The script itself will actually change who it's been associated with. So at that point in time, I now have this open task, or this open new component with an open task. So what I'm going to do is actually manually run this script. As we mentioned, right now we're doing it manually. This could be a cron job and eventually will be rolled in as a plugin. And what this is going to do is this is going to reach out, in this case, to FlexNet Code Insight version 6, see if there already is an associated request for this component. If there is not, it will actually generate a new request. So you can see right here, there is a new request ID of 5, and it's currently in the draft state. So if I refresh this page here, I will now see that I have an associated workflow request as well as that key value pair thing that Alex mentioned. In this specific case, I'm just presenting the URL for that request. The specific ID, is there any activity, and currently, what is that current review level in version 6? If I click here, it brings me right into version 6, right into that request. I am the current owner of that. So I can go through here, update any other information that's required, and then submit that request. So at this point in time, that request is now sitting there in the pending state, waiting for the next level of review. If my script then runs again, it's going to go out, see if anything has changed, and whatever has changed for this request or any other request, it'll bring that information back into the task for version 7. If I go back into version 7 now, refresh this, I can see that I've updated it now, where I can see I'm actually in engineering review level, and then the information about who the actual contact is, last activity. We are also currently actually updating the task itself, so it's now being owned by that user in version 6. And then that information also has been presented within the task itself, so you can have a quick view of the details within the task as well. If I go back into version 6 now, and this is a really short review cycle, and I log in as the next level, and I can go here and see the request assigned to me, and I'll say this one right here. And in this case, I'm just going to approve it. And so at this point in time, the request itself has reached its termination point. If I go back now and rerun the synchronization script, it'll basically realize that that has been approved, and it'll take any comments, or sorry, not comments, any information associated with that in regards to the approval level. If I now refresh this, I can see that OpenSSL has now been marked approved. If I look at my request, I can see it has reached a termination point within the version 6 workflow as well. And if I look at the task, obviously the task has been closed. And once again, that last level of information is pushed into the task itself. And we can see the owner remains as who it was when it was actually closed. So that's a real quick view of the version 6 kind of integration for that. Very similar process for Jira as well. If I go into something I have set up to actually talk with Jira, I can sit here, I'll add a new component. Do PNG this time. I'll grab a version of that and mark it as disclosed. And now once I go into synchronize for Jira, it's going to go out there. It's going to create a new task issue within Jira, so workflow 55. So if I refresh this, everything else is pretty much exactly the same in regards to how things would look on version 7. I have the information bubble that talks about the key value pairs that I've decided to pass back in this instantiation. So the Jira issue, summary, current status, reviewer, activity time. Once again, I can jump into Jira. And then I can see, where am I in the current workflow? So I can see right now, real simple, I'm going to engineering, security, legal. I'm currently in the submit request phase. So once again, I'm going back into the workflow system to update any other information I may require. In this situation, I'll just submit it, which then moves it into the next review level for engineering. If I then go back and resynchronize, once again, just as it was in version 6, the information is pulled from Jira, pushed back into FlexNet Code Insight. So if I go back and look here, I can see now it's once again is an engineering review, waiting for review by the engineering manager and the other information around that. So that's pretty much it for the demo itself. I saw a question pop in. Let me see if I can find out how to see that. Give me 1 second here.
Yeah, question from
Yeah.
Rob.
It's one thing. So the synchronization in terms of how the script is actively set up right now, it's based on the disclosure key off, but that was just a choice that we made. So it does not necessarily need to be. It could be on a post-scan thing. So the way that this script is set up now is a task will be generated anytime an inventory item has not been reviewed automatically by policy. So if there's not an easy approval rejection by policy, the task will be created. And then the synchronization scripts will find all open tasks. And as I mentioned, I have another qualifier for an item being disclosed, but that's just a choice I made for this iteration. So it's not limited only to that.
Today's area of focus is data reuse capabilities, and all of this is in the spirit of increasing effectiveness of using FlexNet Code Insight. So when we talk about data reuse capabilities, we're really talking about the opportunity to save redundant work, to make the system learn in some cases, to allow you to manually reuse data from project to project, and basically be able to save cycles once you've done certain work manually in the past. So the first area that we're going to talk about is custom detection rules. So these are, actually one other point I should mention is a lot of this is kind of heavily weighted towards version 7, but in many cases, similar functionality, although it may be implemented in other ways, is also available in version 6. So the concepts definitely apply to both, but in a lot of cases when we talk about specific screenshots, we're really focusing on 7 because that's the path forward. So if anybody has specific questions on, well, how does this apply to 6 or vice versa, please bring them up as we go through it. So custom detection rules are designed to help translate manual analysis work into something the product will do in the future for you and save rework in certain scenarios. So we'll talk about those. Then we got project data export import. So we've talked about this in the past, but it was relevant for this topic as well. This allows you to reuse audit data across projects. There's several use cases for this. It can range from you want to branch a particular code base, or you know that there's some common files between 2 projects and you would like to save manual work. Could be that you had our services audit team do some work on your behalf and you want to pull it into your system once they're done with the audit. Could be that you're sharing data across multiple instances of Code Insight. So there's a lot of different use cases this supports, but this is kind of the fundamental backbone of a lot of the features that we're working on around data sharing across projects. And we'll talk about the scenarios. Then we got link projects. This is a new feature coming out in R2, and this will be out in about a week or so. And this really allows you to reuse your audit work in cases of subcomponents, modules, anytime that your code base is spread across multiple projects. So I know we got a lot of customers who have a use case around an application that consumes common code, and the desire to not have to redo any sort of analysis work when the code shows up in various products. So this is a way you can do that, and we'll look at how that manifests itself in the product. Then we got project branching. So this will be a sneak peek into what we're doing in R3, which is slated for August timeframe. And this is designed to take the capabilities we have around export-import, around affiliation, and make it easier to branch a project in FlexNet Code Insight, similar to what you would do in GitHub or any other engineering toolchain. So we do have project branching support in version 6. You'll see 7 will be conceptually similar, although different interface, much more guided approach, and also have more configuration options around what you want the result to look like. So we'll talk about that. And then finally, linked inventory. So we're starting to get into this notion of provenance and where inventory came from. So think of it as kind of your family tree, right? You want the ancestry of where the inventory item originated in your organization, also where it's been reused, where certain data may have been inherited from. So understanding that you may have approved a component in one project, it shows up in another one. You don't want to redo the review, but you want to be able to see the original context of when the review was done. So all of that would be available through the provenance feature, again, slated for R3, planned for August. Okay, so the rest of the time I'm going to kind of go through each of these topics in details, but before I do, anybody have any questions on these? Are there other scenarios people are interested in, anything specific I should focus on? Yeah, feel free to unmute yourselves if you have any comments. Okay, so then we will dive right in. Okay, so first topic is custom detection rules. So this is a feature that we've had for some time, both in 6 and 7. We've done work recently in 7 to expose web UI support for creating custom rules. There are many different types of rules that we have, and they lend themselves in different ways to being extensible by users. So the place where we decided to start focusing is single file exact match rules. So based on the MD5 hash of a scanned file, similar to the auto-write-up technique, but a little bit different in how this is exposed. So the idea is if we do a scan and we identify a file that has a particular hash, and this is something that has a rule behind it, we will automatically write up the file the exact same way as what is written in the rule. Now, there are 2 ways that these rules can be created. One, and this is what the screenshot shows, is as part of inventory context. So you have an inventory item that was either created during the scan, maybe it was imported from another project, maybe it was manually created by an auditor, but you have it written up with the appropriate files the way that you like. The component version license has been vetted. You look at the vulnerabilities, you've got all your notes in place, notices, all that is there. And what you want to do is you want to say, next time, if any of these files show up, I want to go ahead and automatically write it up. So the way that this works is when you click on Create Custom Rule, you will get a form which is populated based on the inventory item from which you invoke this logic, and will default all these fields. And then you have an opportunity to make further modifications, as well as select which files that are associated to the inventory item are part of the rule. So when you click the Save button, what will happen is for each selected file, we will create an MD5-based rule with information that is populated in the form. So if that file shows up in a subsequent scan, it will get automatically put into this inventory item with the write-up as you see in this dialog. All right, so it essentially lets you say, take the work that I've done manually and create a rule next time so I don't have to do the work. Now, you have control over which files will trigger the logic, right? It could be one or more. It is an OR, right? So any of the files that you select will trigger the logic. It doesn't have to be a combination. So this is kind of the most intuitive way to do it. There's a second way to do it, which is more of a proactive case. So if you go into the menu and you click on custom data, you will see the exact same form available if you click on create custom rule, except it will be blank, right? Because we're not working in an audit context. So you can proactively go in and create whatever rules you want, but you will have to specify the component version license, fill in all the fields, provide MD5s and file names, and then you can go ahead and save the rule. Right? So both are supported, proactive and reactive following an audit. And this is a great way to reduce future manual analysis efforts if you have files that are common across multiple projects. Okay, let me stop here for a sec and see if there are any questions, comments. Has anyone tried to do this? Love to hear any feedback. You guys hearing me out there, or no one has anything to share? Christine, you're hearing me, right?
Yep, I can hear you, Alex.
Yep. All right.
Yep.
Okay. Move on to the next one. So next item is project data export and import. And again, as I mentioned, there are many use cases for this. This was a feature originally developed in version 6 for the single use case of if you happen to hire our analysis or our audit team to do services work for you. This was a way that they can not just deliver an audit report, but also deliver data back into your instance of Code Insight. It has since evolved into several use cases where it supports moving data project to project, being able to merge projects, to split projects, to move data system to system. So this has kind of become the framework by which data can go project to project. You will see this exact same set of capabilities surface themselves as part of the branching feature we'll talk about later. But over the last couple of releases, we have spent cycles on further improving controls on the import process. So when you export, it is a single button click, and all the data basically gets dumped into a data file that's stored on the client. When you import, you select that file, which is a zip file containing a JSON inside. And then you have a set of options on what do you want us to do. So you have options both on do you want us to add files to inventory and do you want us to mark files as reviewed, yes or no. And if you select yes for any of those, then you have a set of choices on how do you want us to process file matching criteria. So in the past, what we did is we allowed you to select on whether you want to match files by a complete path or by MD5 or a combination of the two. We have since expanded this based on some feedback from a couple of customers, and we now support this whole set of options on the right. So you can essentially pick and choose whatever combination you want of only the MD5, so only the hash of the file, only the file name, right, if you want to be very loose and very liberal about it, all the way to complete file path, and then everything in between. So there's an option now to configure if you want to match based on partial file path, how many elements in the path do you want to match. So if you put, for example, 0 here, that means you're only looking at the file name. If you put 1, you're looking at the parent, the directory and the file. If you put 2, you're looking at the parent directory, the current directory, and the file, and so on. So think of it as the number of path elements starting from the file name and moving left into the path. You have the same options for both, right? So you can have different criteria for adding files to inventory, as well as marking files as reviewed. Right? Typically, you're probably going to be more strict around marking files as reviewed. Likely more liberal around adding files to inventory because you can always remove them. And then also there's options on what do you want us to do with notes. Do you want us to overwrite notes in the target project, or do you want us to append notes on top of the notes that are already in the project? So a lot of these choices will ultimately depend on what use case you're trying to implement with this feature. In cases where you're trying to start a project off as a derivative of another, your likely flow is going to be that you scan a new project, you don't do any work on top of the scan, and then you import results from another project on top of that, and then you do your manual analysis. So in that case, what you're doing is you're overwriting what the system did with output of the work done by a human in another project. There's also cases that people have used where they will do this every week, right? They will kind of keep projects in sync by moving data from a master project into other slave projects. So it really depends on what you're trying to accomplish. If anybody has any questions on specific use cases, we can certainly provide guidance. But this, think of this as a generic capability to move data from project A to project B. Okay. Any questions or comments on this? Okay. Moving on. So the third use case is a new feature, and it's called Link Projects. And Link Projects is similar in concept to what we used to call child projects in version 6. And the idea of this is that we would like to be able to associate two projects together. And for now, we've implemented a construct of parent-child, but we could see others, right? There's other use cases around sibling or perhaps superseded by or maybe a derivative work. But for now, the implementation here is all about parent-child relationship. And the idea is that if you are building an application and your application is constructed of modules that have been developed and audited in a vacuum, right, and you want to reuse that information, you can do so with this feature. So the way that this works and the way it's shown here is I have a project called Mixbag3. And what I've chosen to do is say that my ePortal CI demo is a child of Mixbag3. So what will end up happening is we've now set up a hierarchy where ePortal CI demo is a child of Mixbag3. Likewise, I can select multiple. So if you look at the screen on the right, when you do make the selection, we now have a project hierarchy section. And you can view a list of parents as well as a list of children that you have configured. So you never pick the parent, you always pick the child, and then the parent basically understands that the child is present. And this relationship allows you to essentially do whatever you need to do with that relationship hierarchy. So by default, what we do is we use this for producing an indented bill of materials. This can also be used to understand where a certain component has been used in tool chain and in your code bases across the system. So there's several scenarios that can be used. If you look at how this manifests itself in the product, is if you look at, this is a new screen from our R2 release, again, coming out at the end of the month, and this is the new global inventory page. So this shows your inventory across the system, or in this case, inventory for a particular project with an option to also include child items as nested bill of material. So you'll see in the first version of this UI, it's a flat list, and there's a column to denote what project holds the inventory item. There's an icon here that you can click on to understand the relationship between this project and your mixed bag project. And then you see a flat list of inventory items. In R3 in August, we're working on collapsing the first two columns here into a tree. So you'll get a similar view to the code base panel in Analysis Workbench. But basically what you're able to do is you're able to see a complete bill of material from your application down that encapsulates all of your subcomponents, modules, reusable code, anything that has been audited elsewhere. So if you look on the right here, this is an example of a custom report that Sean's developed, which gives you an actual hierarchy view. So on the top here, you can see that there's a top-level project. It contains 2 children, and then there's a listing of inventory indented to show you your full bill of material. And then the colors are just the review status of approved, rejected, not, and ready for review. And then the kind of the worst status will roll up to the project to indicate whether there's additional work or not. All right, so this gives you one example of how the data can be used. There's certainly other use cases. So if anybody has any questions, comments on this, I'm happy to answer. Okay. Moving on, so project branching. So this is a new feature that we are working on for R3, again in August. And this is intended to support a specific use case of, how does dashboard look for link project? So the dashboard will look the same. The link projects manifest themselves in the new global inventory view, or you can either view, so let me go back here. So you can either view inventory across the system only for your project or for a specific project with all of its descendants included. Right now, the dashboard page, the project folders page, is a single project view. So at the moment, we don't do any roll-up there. We do envision a case where you may want to say, I want all of the charts and all the data to represent the full hierarchy of the entire code base from child projects. So that is something on the roadmap, but at the moment, that's not in plan for this year. Any other questions on the Link projects? Okay, so project branching, again, is intended to be a specific use case where if you branch your code because you are either working on a new release or you have just released and you want to branch to have a snapshot of that release code base, then you also want to branch the project in Code Insight. So Code Insight is designed to essentially follow your repo that has your code base for a particular release of a particular application. So this interface or this implementation is going to be wizard-based, so it's a little bit different from the way we did this in 6. And the idea is going to be that we will lead you through a set of screens, and the screens will capture all the information and all the directives on how to perform the branching. So the branching, so this will be a very similar experience to running an installer, right? You go through the screens, next, 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 and then go ahead and do the work. The screens will be revealed based on previous selections. So it is possible, and these are preliminary designs, but it is possible that certain defaults will be applied or maybe certain questions will be answered depending on how you answer this step. So like here, if you selected upload code base, depending on our final design, we may or may not show you the version control settings unless you selected sync from source control. All right, so I think right now the approach is we're going to start very basic and we'll mature this feature in subsequent releases. So you will go through a first tab, which will give you information on how this process will work. Then you go through the project information, which will let you specify the name of the new project, select the policy profile, scan server, scan profile, and how you want us to obtain the code. Then go through pointing to the right repositories if you're using a source control, or point us to the right archives to upload for your new code base. Then you will get to the project copy settings on what you want us to do with the data, and then that will get merged in with the reconciliation settings. So if I open these up, you'll see that sequentially you go through all the settings and tell us what to do, whether you want to maintain the review status, whether you want to roll it back, whether you want to associate files to inventory. So very similar to what you would do in the import dialog set of options. The other thing that is interesting here is we're now starting to implement new functionality around inventory reconciliation. So inventory reconciliation is designed to logically remove redundancy from your bill of material. So if you have multiple inventory items with the same component, for example, there's an opportunity to potentially merge them into one inventory item. It could be that the scanner had 5 different techniques and each one may have produced a component from a different repository. So this is an opportunity to create a single item representing those files and create a rule as part of it, and in the future not have to do this reconciliation manually. It's also an opportunity to take data that may be partially available in one inventory item and completely available in another and make them the same. So one example could be that perhaps the scanner found a component but could not identify version or license, and maybe the analyst separately found the same component but was able to find version and license. And now there's 2 inventory items representing the same component that could potentially be merged together. So reconciliation is all about doing that. So it'll have options around if you find a component and version match, do you want us to set the license on the item missing the license to the one that has it? Same thing for if you find a component license match, do you want us to automatically set the version? Do you want us to update publish status? Do you want us to update the review status? So you have full control over what's going to happen. The UI will be slightly different. I think we're looking more to a table view than a bunch of checkboxes here. But the idea will be that you can tell us in this circumstance, do the following, in a different circumstance, do something else. And this will be defaulted to what we feel are the right combination of settings, but they can be controlled at a project level every time you do a branch. Now, as part of this, the reconciliation feature will also get pulled into the import functionality from a couple of slides ago. So whether you're using branching or whether you're manually importing data, you will be able to use the reconciliation feature to make the bill of material as clean as possible. Okay, let me stop here and see if there's any questions on this. So anybody who's used branching in version 6 and has any feedback, happy to hear that as well. So final item, and this is linked inventory, right? So similar concept to linked projects, except we're now at an inventory level. And the idea behind this is inventory provenance. All right, so what we want to be able to indicate is if you're looking at an inventory item in a particular project, we want to give you some idea of, did this item originate here? Did this item come over as part of a branch? Did this item come over as part of an import from another project? So you have some sense of who created it, when it was created, which context did the reviews occur in, and how trustworthy is the finding. All right, so by default, if you create an inventory item, you will see that it has no provenance, it has no linkage to another inventory item, so therefore it originated in this project. However, if you happen to pull an inventory item as part of an import or created it via REST API, or created it via project branching, or in the future we'll have a project data copy feature, then you will see that it will be linked to an inventory item in another project. And this chain of custody, essentially, this linkage can keep going. So what we will show you then is that this particular Apache Commons collection item here was derived from another project, and this is the item from which it was derived. All right, so you get some idea of where did this data come. And if you click through here, you'll be able to see the data in another project. All right, so this is kind of version 1 of this feature. Again, the goal is to give you a sense of how trustworthy is the result. Did you find it here? Did it get cloned from another place? But kind of the biggest use case we're trying to accomplish here is understanding where the review status came from. So if you think of a particular item that was reviewed in, say, this ePortal project, and then you're consuming it into your current project, you likely want to know, why is it approved, right? Who did the approvals? What context was it done under? Is it the same use case as your current project, right? You may have been working on a cloud application and now you inherited this inventory item into an on-prem application. So perhaps you will approve an inventory item in one use case, but not the other. All right, so this allows you to not copy data, but reference it and be able to go back to the point where decisions are made, look at the history and understand what happened there that led to the data in your current project. Today's topic is remote scanning. So what I wanted to do is talk about kind of the difference between code-aware and code insight. This has come up several times, so I want to make sure I address this and that people are able to ask questions if they have them. Then we'll talk about differences between remote and server scanning and what you get in one versus the other. Talk about scan engine framework, how that works, get into use cases around when you're combining scanning either for legal security purposes or pre-post scan and how to make all that work. And then again, talk about futures with respect to the scan engine framework and how it will get better in the future. Okay, code-aware versus code insight. So code-aware has been extremely overloaded as a term, so I know it's caused a lot of confusion. Think of code-aware as our automated discovery framework. Right? It is very similar to the version 6 customers of what you used to have with Analyzer. It is basically a module in Code Insight that is responsible for creating automated inventory. It has a bunch of different techniques that it uses. It integrates with auto write-up, which is our MD5-based discovery technique. It has license discovery. It's got its own exact file match technique. It's got search term analyzer techniques. So there's basically an umbrella of automation that is fired as part of a scan. It runs first whenever it is invoked as part of a Code Insight scan, and it is a standalone module. So code-aware manifests itself in a couple of different ways. Number one, there is a feature-clipped version of it for free available on the Revenera website, and is designed to be a Java, NuGet, and Node quick scanner, essentially. So it has its own UI, lets you point to a directory, scan it, and you get a nice HTML report as a result of it. It is also integrated into Code Insight, so anytime you do a server scan in Code Insight, code-aware runs first, does all the automated discovery, and then whichever files were not explained by the code-aware portion of the scan, our standard legacy deep dive detection techniques fire on those files. And then thirdly, it is the lightweight scanner that is wrapped around our scan engine framework. So whenever you run a plugin scan, so either Jenkins or a build server scan or a Docker scan, essentially a lightweight copy of CodeAware gets installed on the remote server and does a scan there and sends results back to CodeInsight. So anytime we talk about CodeAware, we're essentially talking about the umbrella of automated discovery techniques that we have as part of CodeInsight functionality. A couple other things to note is CodeAware does have its own update service. So every time CodeAware is invoked as part of a scan, whether it is on the scan server, as part of a CodeInsight server scan, or as part of an agent, it will communicate with NVD, download a feed of the latest vulnerabilities, and do an update of all the CVEs. So it is always up to date with vulnerability data, and you will get the latest vulnerabilities whenever you run a scan. It also delivers rules through its update service for CodeAware to run, and these rules are delivered in encrypted JSON files. So it basically has its own embedded update service to keep its rules and the metadata around vulnerabilities up to date. Vulnerabilities are processed no more than 4 hours apart, so every time you do a scan, we do a check, and if there's a new feed, we download a copy of that. So you can be assured that all the CVEs are up to date with each scan that you do. Okay. All right, CodeInsight. So CodeInsight is the official product, right? It's an integrated SCA platform that supports various levels of code-based scanning, manual file-level analysis, inventory review remediation, and alerting. CodeInsight internally makes use of CodeAware as for its automated discovery, but CodeInsight is the full product with the web UI, and CodeAware is the automated discovery module that is inside CodeInsight. Okay, so any questions on any of this or comments? Okay. So let's talk about Scan Agent Framework. So Scan Agent Framework is essentially an SDK that we deliver. It is the framework that is responsible for allowing you to do remote scanning on the various engineering applications shown on the left here with all the icons, all the various logos. It essentially is responsible for understanding the remote system, performing the scan, and sending results back to CodeInsight to visualize this inventory in the project. So if you look at the way that kind of this architecture slide, on the left you've got your various engineering applications, and there's a plugin for each of these. On the right you've got an installation of CodeInsight with a core server, optional scan servers with CL for each one, and a database that it communicates with. The in-between is the lightweight scanner. So this is essentially a lightweight version of CodeAware. The scanner is downloaded by the plugin, and the scanner is kept up to date. So if we publish a new CodeAware release, then the plugin will refresh the installation on the target machine. The scanner takes care of doing the data updates so that we, again, have the latest vulnerabilities that we report back to CodeInsight. So the scan plugin's job is to use the CodeInsight Scan Agent Framework SDK. It understands the environment it's operating in, so it knows what to scan for these various ecosystems. It is configured with a CodeInsight URL, the user access token, project name, and then in R3, when it comes out, you'll also have a fourth parameter, which will be a plugin alias. And the reason we've added a fourth parameter is now that we have merged projects, we need to have a label for the plugin so that it can be integrated into the same code base tree as server scanning. So we'll talk about that in a couple of slides. So the plugin connects to CodeInsight, downloads the scanner, runs an update if necessary, invokes the scan on the plugin server, right? So we're not moving files to our machine, we're doing the scan remotely. And when the scan is done, a JSON response is sent back to CodeInsight. CodeInsight will process that, create inventory, and represent the findings in the CodeInsight project. Okay, so that's how the Scan Agent Framework works. And on the left, you can see all the various logos we have for the plugins. Now, the SDK is available. There is some basic documentation around it. So it is possible to create your own plugins for any logos that we don't support, or to take a copy of one of our plugins and modify it with whatever functionality is needed beyond what we ship out of the box. So if that is of interest, certainly reach out and we can help advise on how to get that going. Okay, any questions, comments, feedback on this?
Well, I have scan plugin. So what I have seen, we try to use this plugin, and all it does, it just doesn't.
I'm sorry, I'm having trouble hearing. Can you get a little bit closer to your mic?
Yes, I was talking about we did install this Code Insight Scan plugin on our Jenkins server, and all it basically does is it just starts the scan. It doesn't give any details about like where the scan is making progress, or it's just like schedule scan and just says, oh, bill is successful. I have successfully scheduled the scan.
So we have two different Jenkins plugins. So by the way, everything I'm talking about is version 7 context. Okay, but we do have two different Jenkins plugins. We have a scan scheduler plugin, which is designed to do what you just said, is schedule a scan on the scan server of the same snapshot of code that the build consumed. And then we have a scan agent plugin, which will do the scan in the Jenkins workspace. So if you're using the Jenkins Scan Agent Framework plugin, it should be doing the scan as part of your build of the build artifacts that were produced, and then sending the results back to Code Insight so you can see the inventory items.
In this version 7, we just installed version 7 on our infrastructure. We were using version 6 before. So, like if we're doing builds on particular server, right, we can have this Code Insight Scan plugin as a part of the job. And it runs on a build server. I don't have to have a dedicated scan server for this, right?
Exactly.
Okay.
Yes, and we'll talk about in the next slide the difference between that scan versus moving the code to our scan server. Because there is a difference between the two. But yes, that's the exact idea, is as part of your pipeline definition or part of your Jenkins build definition, you would have a recipe step to do a scan, and then the results would go back to Code Insight. So you could also wrap an additional set of API calls to interrogate the results, and if you wanted to fail the build based on that, that could be done as well. Okay. All right, so let's talk about the difference in scanning. So it's actually a good question we just had that leads us to this topic. So there is a fundamental difference between remote scans and server scans, and today the difference is pretty big. The goal is, as we move forward, to close the gap between these two scenarios. So a remote scan is basically this diagram scenario, right? It means that we are not moving the code to the Code Insight server. We're instead taking a lightweight scanner, installing it on an engineering application server, whether it's in your IDE locally or a build, CI/CD container, artifact repository, and we're doing a scan remotely. So what that means is the scan is not utilizing our compliance library, right? We're not doing any sort of forensic scanning. What we're doing is we are allowing you to introduce SCA scanning as part of your development process. It allows us to scan remote engineering systems in the appropriate context where dependencies have been resolved, and then send information back to Code Insight to represent as inventory. The focus of the scan is to target top-level packages and direct and transitive dependencies. So so if we're talking about a CI/CD or a build agent, then we're talking about scanning artifacts that are produced by the build. You guys mind muting on your line if you got the noise? It is also looking inside archives for packages, right? So if you have a zip file or if you have an RPM, it'll look inside various archives to identify inventory inside their archive files. File level evidence at the moment is not supported, so we'll talk about when that will change. And the analyst does have an opportunity today in R2 to go in, look at the bill of materials that were created automatically, modify them, delete them, add new items. So in the current product in version R2, there is no analysis workbench support for a remote scan, right? So it's an inventory-only project, and all you can do is operate on inventory. That is going to change in R3, and we'll talk about that on the next slide. Now, when we talk about server scanning, the server scanning is fundamentally different in that we bring the code to us as opposed to taking the scanner where the code is. So we either use source control to sync the code, or we can support manual upload of code with various bursting options on how much of the archives do you want to burst, whether it's just top level or recursively. Scan server also supports scan profiles, so you have a lot more control over the depth of scan the search terms you want to use. Do you want to handle dependencies? Do you want to look inside archives and so forth? So there's a lot more settings around the scan. However, the server scan does the exact same thing the remote scan does, and then some, right? So you're not losing any fidelity by doing a server scan. You're actually able to do both the automated inventory plus the file level forensic scans that we have done in both V6 and V7. So the things that it can do beyond the automated discovery is it will report on exact matches. It'll do the copyright detection, like email URLs, search terms, and source code fingerprint matches. So all of that depends on the scan profile that you use and how you configure the scan, but it gives you the full depth of scanning at a file level. The other thing that server scanning supports is manual analysis. So Analysis Workbench is supported for server scans. Again, in R2, it is not supported for remote scans. So the analyst has full control to do manual analysis and further refine the bill of materials. So the thing we're going to talk about next is, with the work that we're doing to eliminate the distinction between project types, these two things come together. So you will be able to do both server scans for your deep dive along with plugin scans in the same project and be able to utilize Analysis Workbench to visualize the results of both types of scans. Okay, so any questions here, and then I'll move on to talking about merge projects. Okay, so let's talk about merge projects. So this is one of the bigger stories that we have in R3. And again, the objective was to eliminate the distinction between standard and inventory-only projects, to be able to combine pre-post build scans into a single project, and to be able to combine multiple plugins if you wanted to do your build scan, your IDE scan, and potentially like your Docker server scan all on one project at various phases of your development process. You can now do that. So the first thing that we're doing is we are eliminating this concept of type, right? So type will be gone. Legacy inventory-only projects will continue to be supported throughout this year. We reserve the right to eliminate them in 21, and if we do, we will support migrating off of them into the new unified projects. But inventory-only projects typically do not have a lot of human-entered data in them, so they're very easy to reproduce just by reconfiguring your plugin in the new unified project and doing a scan that way, right? So there's not a lot of data to move across. The new unified projects will require new versions of the scan plugins, so we will release a new set of scan plugins. So if you are creating new projects in R3, you will need to update the plugins on the servers that you want to configure to send results into those new projects. The UI is now expanded to support both scan server as well as agents, and it's multiple agents. So you'll see things like scan paths, for example. You'll have scan paths on a particular scanner. You will also have scan paths configured for your various scan projects and remote scans. And this is why we've added an alias label, so that when we do show you your remote scan paths and when we show you things in the codebase tree, they can be designated with a top-level folder explaining what context the files are under. Okay, so that's part one of the change. Part two of the change is Analysis Workbench has now been expanded to support both server scanning as well as the remote files. So you will not be able to visualize the remote files because they're not, we don't have a copy of them today. But you will be able to get evidence that was discovered remotely shown to you in the evidence summary. So the first thing is the code-based files panel, right? So this panel here, along with the advanced file search results panel, will support a combined view of both scanner and remote files. So you will see top-level directories with the alias name and explaining what host the alias is installed on, the plugin is installed on. So Jenkins build on build.revenera.com, scan server on scan.revenera.com. And below that will be the paths for the files that were scanned. In R3, we're going to stick with absolute file paths just because we ran out of time. In R4, we will be making some improvements to this, and we'll talk about that in a moment. So anything you can do with files in Workbench, you should be able to do with remote files as well. So you can add them to inventory, you can view their evidence, you can mark them as reviewed. The only thing you cannot do is you cannot download the file, and you cannot go to exact and partial matches because that is not performed on the remote scans. Okay. And then when you're looking at inventory, inventory will have a mix of the files associated with it. So it is very likely that you scanned a manifest file coming out of your source control, and then you scan the output of your build, and those two sets of files will be combined together into a single inventory item representing that component. Right? So that's the objective of this. And then finally, project dashboard and reports have also been updated. So the scan summary tile and the project dashboard has been split to give you scanner and remote scan information. So all of the remote scan agents will be rolled up into one set of numbers. And then reports have also been expanded to include files from both remote as well as the server scan. With respect to next release, there's 3 things that we're working on. So number 1, we are going to include icons representing the various plugins that we have in the tree. In R3, it's just text, but you will see in R4, we'll have an icon for Jenkins and Bamboo and so forth, so you can kind of visually identify where the files are coming from. We're also going to switch all of these to relative paths. So the paths you will see will be relative paths under the remote plugin root or under your scan folder root on the scan server, right? So in this case, home Palamida scan root 500 would not be shown. It would just be / whatever is the top level directory of your code base. Okay, so that'll make it much cleaner. Also will give us a lot of real estate back by not having the long paths. The third thing that we're doing in R4 is, since license detection has been moved into the scan agent framework, we will start reporting license results for the remote scans. So when you go to file evidence in the workbench, you will be able to see the licenses discovered as part of the remote scanning. Okay, questions on any of these? Okay, so let's talk about some use cases. So Julia brought up that we had a few customers reaching out to CSMs with questions around how do I handle kind of the 2 most popular scenarios, which is legal and security both have an interest in the scan results. How do I satisfy both stakeholders? So we'll talk about that. And then the second scenario is pre-post build, right? I want to scan, I want to do a deep scan on my source code before that goes into the build. I also want to do an automated discovery scan of the artifacts that come out of the build. How do I put everything together into a unified bill of material? So we'll talk about that as well. So for the first case, the legal security case, it's important to understand kind of what drives the culture of the 2 stakeholders. So if you look at security teams, right? Security teams obviously focus on security risk. They typically don't pay much attention to licensing. That's something that's handled by legal. So they don't really focus in on safe items, right? The main focus on security teams is anything that's vulnerable. And the focus has to be on all components with vulnerabilities. Security teams typically have frequent scan requirements with a big focus on automation, right? Vulnerabilities come and go. They get replaced with other vulnerabilities. They get patched. So there is no time to do manual analysis to be able to identify vulnerabilities. So therefore there's a big reliance on automation and big reliance on frequency of scan and alerts to let people know when something that used to be clean now has a new vulnerability. The other thing to note is security teams typically have a pretty easy path to remediation where usually it's an upgrade to a more recent release. Right? So you're not talking about swapping out components in all cases. You're not talking about negotiating licensing. Typically, you go to the head of tree or to a couple of releases back where the particular vulnerability of interest has been fixed and grab a new version of that component. When you look at legal teams, the behavior is different. Legal teams encourage scanning and require complete and accurate bill of material. Right? They're not focused on certain components. You have to get them all. There may be standards and constraints such as we don't want to look at subcomponents. We don't want to crack open the envelope, right? We just care about the top monolithic packages. But whatever the context of the analysis is, it has to be complete, right? There is no limitation to only vulnerable things or only things under viral licenses. If you're going to comply with legal obligations notices, you have to get your full bill of materials in place. The other element that's different in legal is it's typically harder to remediate. You may have to negotiate a license. You may have to swap out a component or an alternate component with more favorable licensing. it's not as simple as upgrading to a new release. So typically the cycle is longer and more manual work is required if you end up with a scenario where something's rejected, but you really need the functionality of that component. Okay, the other point I'll make is security teams don't have the luxury of kind of fragmenting their scan, right? They can't say we're only going to focus on new products or we're only going to look at these directories. They got to get all the vulnerabilities. Legal teams do have an opportunity to say we're going to kind of stem the bleeding going forward, but we will look back as time permits. So that is not typically an option in the security world. You got to look at everything. When we look at pre-build and post-build cases, right, we're talking about frequent automated scans that scan build artifacts. So every time you do a build, either a continuous build integration or a nightly build, you want to refresh your build material. So any manifest file changes. And then typically less frequent deep dives if necessary, depending on the risk. Focus on composition beyond packages, right? And that's typically going to be done on the pre-build code bases, which come out of your source management system. So the good news is in R3, both of these scenarios become much easier because you can handle them both in one project. You don't have to integrate like an inventory-only project with a standard project and then visually merge the bombs together. That will be done for you with the unified project. So let's go back to this picture, right? This is something we talked about a couple office hours ago when we talked about, well, how do you do this with Code Insight? How do you handle pre-post build? How do you handle more frequent security scans with more infrequent deep dive IP compliance scans? So last time we talked, we really talked about setting up two different types of projects, right? You had a standard project for your deep dives. You had an inventory-only project for your early and often alerts, and you would have to use export-import to get data from one to the other. So the good news is with the merged project, this picture gets much simpler. So you still have the same concept of code bases going into the build together with artifact repositories and build artifacts coming out of the build. But now, since we have the unified projects, you can basically do this together. Right, so the way you would do this is you would create a unified project. The project would be configured to scan your pre-built code base on the scan server, right, where you would configure one or more source management connections. And you would configure whatever build plugins you need to properly cover your build. So if you have a multi-phase build, you may have multiple plugins. If you have a simple single Jenkins build, for example, you may just get away with a single plugin scanning your build artifacts. Second thing you do is you would configure your remote plugins in your CI/CD servers. We typically recommend you start with nightly builds so you get the process moving, and then you can certainly move that into continuous builds as the process matures. And then you want to apply the settings to get kind of the most automation you can. So the automated notifications for non-compliant inventory items, basically policy violations, are things that you would do on frequent plugin scans. So anytime you do a build, if a new package came in, so if package came in, or if you've upgraded a particular package came in, a particular. I'm getting feedback. Can we get folks to meet, please? I'm getting folks to meet, please. Thank you. So if you're scanning your build output, that's going to change your inventory frequently, and that's where you want your policies to automatically reject and generate remediation tasks so you can catch that work in Jira. Right, so you would configure all of the automation settings in your projects for an auto rejection use case. Likewise, you also want to configure your policies to reflect your corporate policy around licensing, security vulnerability, and so forth. So you want to configure policies to auto-approve things that are permissively licensed, not based on usage, and are things that you don't want to spend manual cycles on in legal. Now, the other thing that will be available in R3 is usage-based policies. So you'll be able to create policies that say, based on the component, based on the license, based on the usage of that inventory item, I want to make an auto-approve or an auto-reject decision. So you get more granularity, and you get to have more specific policies that can automate more scenarios than you could in R2. The third thing you want to do is you want to make sure that you have automated remediation tasks set and that you have a Jira plugin configured. And if you don't use Jira and you use something else, we can talk about how to build a plugin for that. But that way you end up getting immediate feedback into developer backlog with anything that's non-compliant. Right, so if you do a new build, a new component pops up, the license or due to vulnerabilities is outside the policy, that developer will automatically get a Jira task on the back end and can react to that. So next step. Next step is when you configure your deep scan for your code, you want to properly configure your scan profile based on your desired level of depth. So you want to set the dependency options, you want to set the various search terms that you have, whether you want to do fingerprint scanning, exact matching. So all of those settings are available, and you want to be consistent across projects. Right? So typically what we would recommend is define a small set of scan profiles for appropriate use cases, and then have people share those scan profiles so you have scanning across the board. Then the next part is if you don't configure your source management plugins, then you can upload your code base. You can select, again, what level of bursting you want in the archives that are uploaded, and then that will specify what code you're scanning as part of the deep scan that goes into the build. Typically, you'd want to synchronize this so that whatever scan you're doing is the same snapshot that the build consumed. That way you're consistent in your results. And that could be done by using either labels or tags or dates in the SCM configuration. Next is you have to determine what is the appropriate frequency for you for the deep scans. Is it weekly? Is it biweekly, monthly, quarterly? Are you going to offload work to our services team, in which case you may be not scanning, but you're importing results from them? So all of that will ultimately depend on your process, kind of your playbook, on how often you scan for forensic level information that will require some manual analysis. Next step is review and reconciliation. So you're going to have scans happening on the scan server. You're going to have scans happening on the build server. And the product will do its best to reconcile everything and put it into a single inventory item. But there will be cases where different components will be found by different techniques. So in R3, the reconciliation is manual, but we do have some sample scripts to help out with it. In R4, we are working on a reconciliation feature that will have a lot of options on how you want the product to reconcile your inventory items. So you will have controls over, if you have a scenario where your component version is the same, license is not the same, what do you want to do? Or a component license matches, but your version doesn't match, so maybe you've upgraded the component. How much data do you want to bring over from one item to the other? Do you want to recall the second item? Do you want to delete the second item? So there will be an entire kind of dashboard to set up your reconciliation logic, and the product will be able to do this work on your behalf. Next step is, again, optional, but an analyst can now come into Analysis Workbench and do some manual review of file level evidence and further refine the bill of materials for that project. So again, you will have lots of inventory items created by the build scan, and perhaps some of the source files get moved into those same inventory items that have evidence of the same components. Okay, next step, publish your desired inventory. And at this point, you now have unified inventory. So you got inventory based on the automated scans on the build. You have inventory based on automated scans on the scan server through the manifest files. And also you have manual analysis that has potentially led you to some forensic inventory items based on fingerprint matches, exact matches, search terms, email URLs, or copyrights. So next step is kind of your standard inventory review. So anything that was not caught by policy, either rejected or approved, would go through a manual review. And again, as part of that, you do have an opportunity to refine the policies. So next time in, you don't have to do the same manual work. And then at that point, you can then work on your third-party notices and then other reports as necessary. And then finally, there is still an option. We've got some customers that do this, to continuously export out of your unified project into kind of a single golden project. So you basically have an export of all of your inventory data that you can then use to try to import to automate additional results. All right, so the idea is all of the audit work that you've done in Trust is exported into a single project. And then if you export out of that project and import back into any other project, you get the benefit of reusing that same analysis in subsequent scans.
Next big item is project branching. So we talked about how users want to reuse existing audit data from one version to another. So we've created a small feature where you can automate this entire process of branching from one version to another, and create the project, reuse the data, and be done with it, right? So we created a new wizard kind of interface, which is similar to an installer, and then you can start from your source project. Let's say you're starting from, in this case, in this screenshot says ePortal 1.3, and then you're creating ePortal 1.4, right? So you can start from ePortal 1.3, start your branching operation, and most of the wizard interface, most of the wizard panels will actually be defaulted to your existing settings, because that's probably what you want to do, because most of the settings across versions will probably be the same. And you can also carry forward your source code from your source project, in this case ePortal 1.3, and if you have any SCM settings configured to it, all of them will be carried forward, and you can modify them during the branching wizard. And let's say you are changing a branch in your Git repo, you can go ahead and modify the branch in the version control settings panel. And after you do that, you have full inventory import options. From the source project, all of the inventory, the existing import options are cascaded down to this panel. And then once you click on finish, I think what it does is it performs a scan of, creates a project. It if there is version control, or if you want to upload a code base, all of them are being uploaded, and it does a code inside performs a scan of the new project, and then it imports data from the source project into the destination project. So that that is where your audit reuse value is, right? And then now you end up with new source code, but old inventory items with reused, audit data that you can reuse. And yeah, so as an extension to this, I think we were also contemplating on performing adding a reconcile feature, which unfortunately couldn't make it to 2020 R3. So in future, I think we'll go ahead and start looking at how we can reconcile the data between a source and a destination. Let's say, for example, you got in the target project, you have indeed updated a version or a license, not just relying on code inside detection, and you actually found that an accurate license is something else, and you have completely updated the source project, and you want to cascade those corrections to the new project also. I think the reconcile panel is supposed to get handy there and take the decisions for you. So this is on the roadmap for a future release. Alex, do you want to quickly add anything on the reconcile?
Yeah, let me jump in with a few thoughts. So today we have a kind of a beginning script that's been developed by Sean to attempt to do some of these scenarios. And the idea is, if you have a source project, so either intro project or across two projects, and let's say you have a source project where you've done the scan, you've done manual analysis, you've cleaned up the bill of materials, so you've manually completed either version or license changes. And then in the new project, you do the scan, and again, you're back to kind of raw system results. You could use the reconciliation script to run across projects and say, make my new project look like the old one with the following conditions. So that's the attempt, is to put a framework in place with a lot of, as you can see, checkboxes for different situations. And in case we have two items that share a component version but don't share the license, what do you want us to do? If they share a component license but don't share the version, so maybe you upgraded the version, what do you want us to do? And give you full control over what changes we automatically make based on what you believe to be the source of truth in another project. This will definitely be multiple releases for us to do this. We are considering long-term making this a framework that's extensible to scripting. So if you wanted to get into more advanced logic, then we would come up with a way to hook in a script to do this. But this is planned to be supported as part of branching, as part of project import, and eventually as a manual invocation, perhaps after a scan, or if a user's done manual analysis and they want to then auto-reconcile we would come up with hooks to do those in all 4 scenarios. So I do think we'll, in the future, probably have an office hour dedicated just to this topic to better understand all the use cases. But this is an attempt to save manual work and make things more consistent. Okay, any questions on branching? By the way, you see that the flow is going to be a wizard, so we've taken a lot of feedback over how we did branching in 6 and are attempting to make it a much better experience for users in 7.
Right. So the next topic is about inventory provenance. Internally we call it linked inventory. So this is about trying to give you a reference link to the origin of the inventory, where it has originated. Like for example, if the inventory is actually created in the current project, we just mentioned the provenance field as originated in this project. But if the inventory is actually imported, from the project, or it is created by a REST API to ensure automations, and or if it is created as a part of project branching, or we intend to add a future feature to copy 2 projects, right? Copy project from one to another. So in any of these cases, what you want really is the way the originate from, so that you can quickly have a link, look at it and take a decision on the approval or rejection of a particular item. So in this case, if it is derived from another inventory in a different project, the provenance field will be set to derived from the inventory in this particular project, and clicking on the inventory or clicking on the project will directly take you to that the project.
Yeah, so one of the main drivers in this feature is we want to represent the accurate context under which something was reviewed. So if you had project A and you reviewed an inventory item and it was approved, and then you're using branching or export import to move the data into project B, we don't want to misrepresent that it was approved in project B. So this provenance feature sets up essentially the pedigree of the item, the relationship, and you can go back to the original review context and understand who approved it under which circumstance. So this is the beginnings of this feature. There is REST API support for it, but there will also be reports that give you an idea of when a particular asset entered the organization and how it's made its way through various applications. All right, any questions or comments on this one? All right.
So on the global inventory page, so this is a page that we have added in the last release, where we have consolidated all of the systems inventory into a single view, and of course you can filter them by your projects or any other additional advanced search criteria. And then we have made this page even more richer and even more informational by having the component information and the license information. So if you look at the information icons for the component column and the license column, clicking on them will show up the relevant information about the component or the license. And we also, I think in the last release, we just were reporting just the number of vulnerabilities. So we made that even more informative. So we have the regular vulnerabilities widget being displayed here. So clicking on that will actually show you the vulnerabilities dialog, and you can click on further links to navigate to NVD to find out what exactly they are. And so the tasks and alerts also have improved. Clicking on any of the available tasks or open alerts for any of these particular inventory will show up the alerts dialog or the task dialog readily here, so that you can take action here itself, so that and would not have to navigate to your project or the project inventory page for the corresponding project.
Yep. So 3 things kind of roadmap wise that we're working on to further improve this is, number 1, collapsing the first 2 columns into a tree. So you'll get a hierarchical view of your parent-child projects and the inventory under it. Then we're also looking at a slide out panel to let you perform essentially the same actions that you could in a project inventory view. And then at the top of the page, we're going to introduce some charts similar to what you would see in the project folder dashboard. But this way, whatever inventory is returned based on your search criteria, that will get rolled up into charts above, so you get an idea of your license exposures, vulnerabilities, and overall review status. So those are all things that are planned during the 21 year. Okay, and then I think, yep. So now let's talk about policies.
Yeah. So this one significant improvement that we have done to existing policies. So up until now, you can actually create a policy based on a license, and then say, hey, if I find a GPL license, version 2, just go ahead and reject it, right? So this might not be, very good, in a case where the component you're actually building or component you're actually disclosing is not being distributed in the current project, or it is an internal project and there's line of business app and not really, going public with this, particular application. So, the inventory usage fields that we have for any inventory in the product inventory page or analysis workbench, and once it sets it is an internal application, so I'm fine with a GPL license. So in those cases, I think we'd want to provide more power to someone who is devising the policies to say, hey, go ahead and add additional criteria based for the given license, and say if it is an internal, do this. If it's an external, do that. Right. So so we have added 3 criteria for the inventory usage, distribution type, linking, or modified. So based on this in combination with the license, you can take a decision on approval or rejection of a particular inventory item. And yeah, you can actually go ahead and create multiple licenses, multiple row items, multiple criteria for the same license. So, GPL internal do this, GPL external do this.
So as part of the user group, we talked about our intent to start open sourcing some of the product extensions. And I'll quickly go through the slide, and then I'll hand it over to Sean to demo a few things. So we had 4 targets in mind. So the first was in version 7, we do have a custom report framework, which allows you to develop your own custom reports or modify some examples that we've developed. And since the user group, we did release 3 of them through a public GitHub repo, so you can see the URLs listed here. So we'll talk through what you do with this, how you use them, and how you go ahead and create your own reports based on these, or just starting from scratch. We also have plans in the future to release the code for all of our plugins. So the reports are implemented in Python, the plugins are in Java. So that means that if you want to create your own scan plugin or IDE plugin or ALM plugin, you can look at our reference implementations and use that as a way to guide your code for your own cases. Also looking at open sourcing our workflow synchronization script. So we have one for version 6 workflow as well as Jira example. And then finally, Sean's developed a cookbook, which is a framework for implementing custom utilities. And that will also get opened up along with the code behind the script. So let me turn it over to Sean. He's going to show a couple reports, how they look, and how you can go about making use of the code that we released. And then we'll have happy to answer any questions based on that. So Sean, let me make you the presenter.
Okay. 1 second here. So as Alex said, we basically released 3 repositories yesterday, and they are now available on our Flexera's GitHub account. So right here, I'm basically filtered to public views, and then searching through the I guess the filter for SCA-Code Insight, all the reports, and pretty much anything that we release in a public forum will start with the SCA/Code Insight. So right now you can see there's actually 5 items here. The bottom 3 are the reports. So we have an inventory report, we have a compliance report, and we have a project comparison report. And each one of these utilizes these 2 other APIs as these other repositories as submodules. So all the branding is contained within here, and all the APIs are contained within here. We go into one of the projects for the project inventory itself, standard GitHub information. We tried to provide as much information within the README as possible. So kind of information about the report, what it does. We will be taking advantage of newer APIs as they're available in different releases. So we will update the specific tags based on that. So for example, in R4, we are expecting some improvements in regards to the APIs for performance, and we'll probably bump that to a version 1.1 tag and reference 2020 R4 for that. As I mentioned, everything is with submodules. So once you install once you clone the initial repository, you will need to init the submodules and update them, and that will pull down the corresponding tags within both the branding repository as well as within the API repository itself. We do have a requirements file as well that would need to be used. Primary requirements, at least for the first 3 we've done right now, is standard requests library. A little bit of configuration that needs to take place in regards to, I guess, take a step back. For people that aren't familiar with the custom report framework, the actual framework will call out to a file. This file can be a self-sufficient script, or it could be what I like to call like a helper file. In my case, I'm actually utilizing helper files. So there's a create report helper file and a batch file as well, depending on what host system you're running on. And then that file itself will initiate the call of the report, passing the arguments that was provided from the framework. And this allows you to really kind of use any languages, et cetera, for that custom report framework versus having just a standard jar file or anything like that. Inside of that report framework, we do need to specify the base URL for the system, and we utilize that for links from the report back into the actual Code Insight instance itself. We are looking to add that to an argument that's being passed from the framework in the future as well. The other thing we have here is a registration script, and this is what's used to actually install the report within Code Insight, so it's available from within each project. And then just more information in regards to kind of what the scripts do. It talks about registering it, and as Alex mentioned, everything here is under the MIT license, so feel free to kind of take it, look at it, and do what you want with it. So what I'll do is I'm going to run through a quick installation of this actual report. So I'm going to clone it. Grab the repository here, go to a window, and clone.
And one kind of other point. So the reports really have dual purpose for being released. Number one, just simply if you'd like to use the report as is, certainly take that. Number two, if you want to create a derivative work, so maybe you want to add a column to a table or change the logo to your company logo, that's certainly possible. Or if you want to use it as a baseline for implementing your own custom report. All right, so Sean's walking me through the third use case, which is how to take what we've done and make it your own.
Yep. So, all right, so I've cloned that. And now as the README mentions, I do need to take care of those submodules. So I'm going to run a git submodule init. Oops, actually, I need to get into my directory first. Now git submodule init. And then I'm going to do the update, which will basically link it to the correct checkout. And at that point in time, the file is ready to go, with the exception of the fact I need to actually register it. So as I mentioned, there is that registration script. And as part of that registration script, you can see there's a base URL, which is the the actual URL for the Code Insight instance itself for those inventory or project links, and then the actual administration authorization token, which is required to install the report. Since I don't feel like cutting and pasting, I created a quick little sed script to do that. So at that point in time, everything's up to date, and then I can run Python registration.py and then register. And what this is doing is showing that my sed script does not do what I wanted to do. Let me actually go here and fix that. And update my authorization token again. Set the wrong one. Bear with me a second. This proves it's not smoke and mirrors. Okay, let's try that again. What is going on here? Now nothing's going to work right for me. Sorry about this. This worked earlier. All right, well, let's assume that one actually worked. I'm not sure why the registration is not working. Something's broken there. But once that's occurred, what would happen is within each project, I would now have an extra drop down for that specific report. So if we quickly go here and look at my report area, I can see I have my standard 3, and then I have 2 new ones. One is the project compliance report. One is that project comparison report. And then we should have had the project inventory report there as well. I can kind of tell you what the output of that one is easily enough. At that point in time, I can run the report. So in this case, I'm going to look at the project compliance report. In this case, it is an HTML output, and we're providing information in regards to the inventory items, priority component data, the version, and then really the main thing over here is that final column is in regards to the compliance issues. So these are things within this report or these inventory items that should be looked at. The item hasn't been reviewed. It's an older version. So in this case, using version 2.3, it's actually 18 versions back from a current one to provide information about that. And really, it's just, what are the items I need to look at to make sure that the associated risk for this component, I'm well aware of it and can take action on the items that I need to. The inventory review is very, very similar to this, except for it does not have the compliance issues column, but the rest of it's there. We are utilizing Bootstrap and data tables, so we take advantage of some of the information there, such as the drop downs or the specific filtering and things like that that comes with that. So this is the project compliance report. The other one we can take a look at quickly is the project comparison report. So if we go to, say, codebase version 1.2, and I'm curious, what has happened since 1.2, comparing it to version 1.3, I can actually go into that report, take a look at that comparison report. We do have the option within the custom report framework to specify currently a second project for purposes just like this. So I can say, let's actually run this report against codebase version 1.2 as well as codebase version 1.3. Generate that report, and this will create another table that shows items that are in common between the things. So in this case, the items that are highlighted in white, Doorkeeper 502 is in both, Tmux is in both, or I can look at the specific differences. So I can say, quickly, I can say, okay, well, Apache struts in codebase version 1.2, I had selected Apache 2.0, and the forge was actually Apache. In my second one, I've changed forges, so I can see that's coming from GitHub. Or in the case of the Java Beans here, my initial project had one license selected, and this one has a different license selected. Allows you to kind of key in on that. Or as well as, in this case, I've moved from version 03.24 in codebase 1. Same component now is in 1.3, just happens to have a different version. So, kind of a first pass in regards to a view of comparing 2 different projects. I have some thoughts in regards to how to update this and kind of add some extra information for this. And obviously, if people start to kind of take a look at these reports and, utilize them, we're definitely interested in hearing feedback about improvements or other possible report ideas as well that we can kind of add to our library of reports for this. I guess the other question in regards to kind of taking these and migrating them into your own reports. At this point, I think the best bet would be to kind of clone the report and then just start to work for that or work from that and make modifications for the columns or possibly the data within there. If changes you're making make sense on a kind of a global scale, we're definitely willing to accept pull requests and report modifications from users of the report as well. So let us know.
Yeah, and these are the 2 use cases I hear most about in the field are how can I compare, for example, inventory across 2 branches. So this report allows you to scan each branch in a different project and then run the separate report to show the differences, as well as give me a punch list of all the items that are either non-compliant or have potential issues, and then give me specific enumeration of what the issues are, and then some sort of canned guidance on what to do. So the tooltips over the compliance issues give you, our static canned guidance, but certainly if you modify the report, all these are static strings in the report, so they can be changed to whatever content you want to provide for your company.
Currently, we have 4 reports available. We have a vulnerability report, a compliance report, a comparison report, and a project inventory report. we were kind of continuing to work on these. First pass for these reports was strictly based on a single project and did not necessarily take any sort of project hierarchy into consideration. So for the people that are not necessarily familiar with that, there's actually a setting in each project where you're able to specify a child project. So if you have some sort of modular development where you have a subset of code that you may use across multiple projects, you can kind of do the work in that one project and then link the work or the actual inventory items associated to that project to a larger project, and you can basically create a hierarchy for that. So what we've started to do is for our reports is actually take that into consideration. So if we are running a report on a parent project, we want to start to tunnel in and grab the information for those child projects and recursively, for their child projects and for their child projects. So if we take a look at the existing project inventory report, it was a flat level for a single project. So we would provide information in that direct project about that inventory items, priorities, vulnerability, where we actually roll up the information. I don't think I actually have any vulnerabilities in this project, but we would take advantage of kind of going through there and calculating everything and kind of rolling it up to give a quick high-level dashboard. What I've done is basically taken that and extending it to pull in that hierarchy data. So once again, we still have that lower level information where we specify the project here, and then we kind of start to roll it up. So you're able to see your project hierarchy. So you can kind of see how each project is interrelated to the other projects. And then you'll see a roll-up data for each individual sub-project. So I can quickly say, okay, well, this one child project has this, these vulnerabilities. The review status is this, or the license status is this. So we kind of roll it up to the project level, and then we take that even further and actually summarize it at the application level. So all the sub-projects are rolled up into a total view, so you're able to see quickly, what's kind of the overall view of the entire application, not just specifically related to a single project. And currently, right now, this is working off of 2020 R3 APIs. As Alex mentioned, we do have a number of API improvements coming in R4 that we'll definitely be using to take advantage of, where we roll up information in terms of vulnerabilities or license data. So it does not necessarily have to be automatically, or does not need to be calculated throughout the project. And then another API, which wasn't on that list, we actually have a project summary API as well, which can be used to grab high-level data relatively quickly for reporting purposes.